A Souls game's difficulty is almost always going to be a subjective matter. You have players with vastly different general gaming skills, different amounts of experience with Souls-like games, a variety of playstyles, and then of course players who play these games solo versus multiplayer co-op, or a mixture of both are going to have different experiences when regarding difficulty. And perhaps even more importantly, a player's first Souls experience tends to be one of their more difficult Souls experiences, because there is kind of a big learning curve, especially for players that are not familiar with this genre of game. For myself, my first FromSoftware game was Bloodborne, and my god did I get my teeth kicked in. Let me know what your first Souls experience was below in the comments. There's no denying that Elden Ring is a Souls game at its core, and despite a few of the cool kids in the comments section, generally speaking, it's a pretty challenging game for the vast majority of players. With that said though, FromSoftware has clearly implemented several mechanics, features, and systems that can make Elden Ring a bit easier than the prior Souls games, at least in certain aspects. Let's talk about it. The first and most obvious change that can make Elden Ring easier than the previous Souls games is the open world and what comes with that. With a giant open world, Elden Ring is the first Souls game that throws the linear experience right out the window. Now, of course, there are still some things in the game that need to be done in a specific order, and there are some roadblocks, so to say, but generally speaking, you can go wherever, whenever you want. What this does is give players the true freedom to farm for runes to level up their character, and also real opportunities to find better equipment, and this also goes for spells. Now you could farm souls, blood echoes, and XP in the prior Souls games, but with a more linear game design, you hit choke points very often where you cannot go any further until you complete a specific objective, and many times that consists of killing a ruthless boss. Because of that, you can find yourself stuck farming the same enemies over and over, and each time you level, it of course requires more and more souls to get to the next level, eventually making those enemies quickly start to feel like they're not worth your time. And because of that, many players will just push on and fight the boss in a really difficult state. In Elden Ring, the open world is yours to explore. You can farm enemies and look for better equipment in the starting area of Limgrave. When you start to feel the diminishing returns from your efforts, or even when you just start to feel boredom, all you have to do is go somewhere else. You have the option to say, nope, I'm not doing that right now, and then you can return later feeling like a demigod. There are some limitations to this, but nowhere near the limitations that you'll experience in the other Souls games, and this is a huge factor that can go into Elden Ring's difficulty. Now you don't have to farm runes, of course, and if you're like me, all you do is really clear out an area one time completely, and then you move on. But there's no one stopping you from spending countless hours just powering up your character, or even just trying to find easier bosses before taking on what feels like your arch nemesis. Moving on, let's now talk about Sites of Marika. Sites of Marika in Elden Ring are optional spawn points for your character when you die. Your other option is of course to respawn on a Site of Grace, which are the places where you can rest, level up, switch your spells, etc. In other Souls games, you don't have Sites of Marika. You only have the spawn points that are akin to what a Site of Grace is. The reason why Sites of Marika can make Elden Ring easier at times is because these spawn points are typically located very close to hard combat encounters or bosses. Those of you who have played other Souls games probably have some rather traumatic memories of dying to a boss, and then having to make the perilous journey from your spawn point back to the boss that killed you. FromSoftware really knows how to smack you in the face when it comes to this, and the journey back to a boss can sometimes add more to your death counter than the actual boss itself. It's a punishing experience that players don't really have to experience nearly as much in Elden Ring because of these Sites of Marika. There are still a few spawns in the game that feel a little punishing, but at large this spawn system was obviously added to save some frustration for newer players to the genre. Now let's talk about spells, Ashes of War, and Spirit Ashes. Personally, I have not played a sorcerer yet with sorceries, but I have heard a lot about it, and my character does have a decent amount of faith in incantations. I don't think many people would argue and say that FromSoftware didn't beef up their magic system. It's pretty clear that they did. Now this doesn't mean that every situation is going to be easy mode for spellcasters. In fact, some might actually be more difficult. But with magic, like in many games, can also come great power. There's not only several places where you can kinda cheese enemies, and it's not always necessarily a cheese, but I think you guys get what I'm saying, where you can hide behind cover and poke out and shoot, and then the boss never comes at you. Or you can stand on a high ledge casting powerful spells down on your helpless enemies below. But there's also an extremely wide variety of spells, allowing players to have more spells at their disposal to figure out their problems. There is of course magic in the other Souls games, but it's pretty clear that FromSoftware spent some extra time making this magic system more robust. For better or for worse, well, that's going to be a matter of opinion. As for the Ashes of War in the game, which are kind of like weapon attachments that you can swap in and out at a site of grace, some players might argue that melee builds can actually have it easier than spellcasters. I don't want to spoil many things in this video, but as you can see right here, I have an Ash of War that allows me to stomp, and then frost spikes shoot out in a cone shape in front of my character. And this absolutely destroys the majority of mobs and even some bosses that I come across. Honestly, sometimes I just choose not to use it because it can literally make some areas and situations too easy. From what I've seen, most of the insanely powerful Ashes of War are magic-based, but many of them don't seem to really require that much FP, making them fairly easy to use even for players who don't focus that much on magic. And like spells, there are a wide variety of Ashes of War to choose from, which of course also gives you more opportunities to solve your problems. I can't leave out the Spirit Ashes, although they have been toned down a bit since the network test, and there are several situations where you cannot even use them. Generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that Spirit Summons in many situations can make Elden Ring a bit easier than the prior Souls games. Spirit Ashes for many players in many situations can be the actual reason as to why they're able to kill a boss, and I think in general they do make combat more approachable for newer players. I should also just quickly mention that NPC character summons also seem to be much more abundant in this game. Now on to the topic of multiplayer. FromSoftware has made the multiplayer experience with Elden Ring a bit easier and less of a hassle than the prior Souls games. Now it is true that the more players that you summon into your world, the more powerful your enemies will become. But in my opinion, nothing really replaces the ability to have players attacking a boss without them being targeted themselves. Multiplayer has always made Souls games tenfold easier whenever I've engaged with it. On top of it just being easier to do and understand, it's also more desirable to use multiplayer now, because summon players can now pick up crafting resources and items, something that you couldn't do in the other Souls games, believe it or not. Moving on to a really important subject, and that is healing. In Elden Ring, there's less of a need than in previous Souls games to return to a site of grace to replenish your healing and also mana flasks. When you rest in all Souls games, most enemies will respawn, which of course refills the world with danger. Resting is very important though, because it's even more dangerous to be walking around without any healing flasks on your character. In Elden Ring, killing mobs of enemies will actually refill some of your health flasks, and you'll also frequently come across these beetle balls that will do something similar. This allows players to keep clearing out areas without having to let all of the enemies that they killed respawn just to get their health flasks back. Bloodborne did have a mechanic where if you performed a visceral attack, you would get some of your hit points back. But in a general sense, Elden Ring is by far the easiest in this regards. The last thing I'll talk about in this video is your spectral steed, Torrent. As most of you are aware, we have never had mounts in a Souls game before. This was a really big announcement when us players heard about it. And with the mount can come several benefits in this game. Now this won't be true for everyone, as I know that some players actually hate fighting on their steed and they feel like they suck at it. But I promise you, once you master it and really learn and understand the ways of the Torrent, you can use it to your advantage, and it's going to make some enemies a walk in the park. Even just simply using hit and run tactics, which won't work for all opponents, but it will work for several of them, will offer players a new way to tackle a tough challenge, and I think it's a worthy point to bring up as to why some players may feel Elden Ring is easier than the other games. To wrap this video up, like I said in the intro, Souls games difficulty is subjective. If Elden Ring feels harder to you than other Souls games, well, fair enough. But I think it's also pretty clear that at the very least, even if the game doesn't feel easier for you in the way that you're playing it, it's definitely a more approachable game to new or inexperienced Souls players. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts below, and I appreciate all of the support as of late on the channel, getting really close to 100,000 subscribers. I'll catch you guys on the next one.